Now, the lecture today is very long awaited because it's about the Angelica Kauffman exhibition at the Royal Academy, which had to be postponed because of the pandemic. And now it's here, and we're all jolly pleased about it. The Kenwood has lent 3 paintings, so we're very much on exhibition there as well. Now, our speaker, Annette Wickham, is co-curator of this exhibition. She is the curator of works on paper at the Royal Academy. And prior to that, she was an assistant curator at the V&A. She has published widely on aspects of the V&A and its collection. And in fact, if you go onto the V&A website, you will find a number of really very interesting, I suppose they are, well, little podcast things, aren't they, about different aspects of the collection. And I recommend that you do that. Annette's research interests include the history, art education in general, and women artists in Britain. So she's absolutely the right person to talk about Angelica Kauffman. Welcome, Annette.
Well, thank you. Good morning, and thanks again to Angela for the invitation to join you today. It's a pleasure. So I've called the talk this morning, Miss Angel Comes to London, referring to the affectionate nickname that Sir Joshua Reynolds gave the painter Angelica Kauffman when he was painting her portrait in the 1760s. But I thought it was also a nice way of referring to our new exhibition at the Royal Academy, because we're very pleased to have been able to reschedule it for this year and bring Miss Angel to London again and show her works on the walls of the Academy, where she was originally a foundation member in 1768. And we're very glad to have the 3 beautiful loans from Kenwood. So I'm going to follow the structure of the exhibition itself, and I've included most of the works that feature in it, along with a few comparative works. So I will try to point out when we're looking at something that you won't actually see in the exhibition, so you won't be disappointed when you get there. And for anyone who hasn't already seen it, I've also included a few photographs of the galleries, so you know what to expect. But the exhibition is divided into 4 sections, and we start with a group of self-portraits. Please excuse this image. It's not quite as good as the last one because I took it myself. But these paintings are actually quite imposing, especially this one in the centre. So in spite of the various obstacles facing women artists at the time, Kauffman was internationally famous in her lifetime, both as a portraitist and a history painter. Her patrons are a list of the great and the good. She worked for various crowned heads of Europe, including Catherine the Great, Queen Charlotte, and also Pope Pius IV, and counted among her friends an array of artists and writers, including Sir Joshua Reynolds, Maria Cosway, Goethe, and Antonia Canova. She was described by one contemporary as possibly the most cultivated woman in Europe, while another declared that the whole world was Angelica mad. And over the last 40 years or so, she's also been the subject of numerous art historical studies, many by my co-curator, Bettina Baumgartel, who's been studying her work for many years, but also by Wendy Roworth and Angela Rosenthal. In the intervening years, she wasn't exactly forgotten, but I think we could say safely that she was sidelined. So the exhibition of over 60 of her works by or relating to Kauffman at Kenwood in 1955 was very much ahead of the curve. So part of the idea of starting with the self-portraits was really to introduce Kauffman and her biography to a UK audience, as we felt that some visitors might be less familiar with her life story. I'm sure most of you do know it, but just to give a very brief sketch of her life before we go on. She was born in 1741 in Chur in Switzerland. Her mother, Cleopatra Lutz, was a Swiss person, and her father, Johann Joseph Kauffman, was an Austrian painter. He travelled wherever the work took him, and so they had a sort of peripatetic life, travelling around the Alpine regions. They lived in Switzerland, Austria, parts of Germany, and northern Italy. As a child, Kauffman was talented both as a singer and as a painter, was considered something of a child prodigy. But at a certain point, she had to choose which one to pursue as her career. And after her mother died in 1757, Kauffman decided to train as an artist with her father in Italy. In 1766, she moved to London, where she stayed for 15 years, including 6 months in Ireland, I should say, as it's St. Patrick's Day. And then in 1782, she moved back to Rome and remained there for the rest of her life until her death in 1807. But the other reason for starting with the self-portraits was to highlight how these are some of her most intriguing and sophisticated works. They were important to her early on in her career as a way of promoting herself and showing what she could do as a painter. But later on, when she was established, they became important in a different way as a means of controlling and shaping her own image for posterity. And the 3 examples that we have on display fall into that category because they date from the 1780s. And they show Kauffman presenting herself in various different guises, a development which also relates to her later tendency to blur the distinction between self-portraiture and allegorical painting. But we start here with a self-portrait that she painted for herself, so very much a private personal image that she kept in her studio for the rest of her life. And it's interesting as well, sorry, the one on the left, I should say, is the one that's in the exhibition. The one on the right, we did request, but sadly it's on a tour of China, so it couldn't come to London. So the painting on the left was painted at a moment of transition when Kauffman was traveling from England back to Italy with her father and the artist Antonio Zucchi, who you'll be very familiar with from his work here at Kenwood, and who she just married. And they stop in the village of Schwarzenberg in the Bregenz forest, her father's hometown, and a place that Kauffman seems to have very much identified herself with, even though she only actually visited on a handful of occasions. And she depicts herself here wearing the traditional summer outfit of the area. And this portrait visually reconnects Kauffman with her roots and reiterates this motif, which she used twice as a very young artist. She painted the portrait on the right when she was only a teenager, and there's another version of it as well. And in this one, she shows herself sitting there with her palette primed, ready to paint. So very much a statement that she was going to follow art as her career. But in the later self-portrait in the same costume, Kauffman appears to be closer to her real age than she is in some of her self-portraits. But are there perhaps some further layers to this apparently quite direct and straightforward image without any props or background setting? Well, at the same time as reconnecting with her younger self and her Austrian heritage, I wonder, was Kauffman possibly also hinting at her art historical knowledge and alignments as a mature artist? Because when you look at it in comparison with some of these other paintings, the angle of her hat seems very much reminiscent of some of Rubens' self-portraits, some of which she would have been familiar with in England, and also his famous chapeau de paille. And it's interesting to see with the 2 paintings on the lower row there, one on the left by Reynolds and one on the right by Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun, that other artists were experimenting with similar motifs at the time. They're all, I think the other 2 are from the year after Kauffman's. I'm not suggesting that they necessarily knew her work because it wasn't engraved until later, but there was something of a zeitgeist interest in Rubens going on at the time. And all 3 artists travelled to or via Flanders in the early 1780s. But then in contrast, we come to this portrait, which presides over the gallery. And this is a very imposing image, which was very much Kauffman's public face. It's how she wanted to be represented for posterity in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, which had a sort of artist's hall of fame full of artists' self-portraits from the Renaissance onwards. And interestingly, they already had an example of her work there, but it was that early portrait that we saw right at the beginning in the Bregenz forest dress. And she felt that by the 1780s, this early example of her work was really not worthy of her, not worthy to represent her in the Uffizi pantheon. So she wrote to the Grand Duke of Tuscany requesting, could she paint another portrait for him to represent herself as a mature artist, and he agreed. She actually wrote the letter in 1782, but didn't deliver this portrait until 1787. She was busy at the time, but I think it also indicates how much thought and effort she put into it. And it paid off. When this arrived in Florence in 1788, It was hung along with the Italian artists right next to a self-portrait at the time they thought was a self-portrait of Michelangelo, so quite successful. And she depicts herself as a very graceful and thoughtful figure, as a sort of goddess in the temple of art. And it has been noted that Kauffman was in her mid-40s at this time and looks rather younger. And of course, who wouldn't be tempted to put a bit of a filter on the selfie after a certain age? But joking aside, I think we should really view this agelessness as a sort of metaphorical motif, because the whole image has a sense of timelessness about it, in the face, yes, but also in the clothing and the setting, which are both fashionably neoclassical, but when you look at it in detail, there's actually very little that ties it down to a particular moment. When you look at other paintings from this date, they're often more fashionable details, but actually she seems to be just really wearing this white robe tied at the waist. And I'd like to draw your attention before we move on to the next section to just a couple of motifs in the painting, as I think they kind of sum up some of the important aspects of Kauffman's approach, which we'll see as we go on. So scholars of her work have drawn attention to the way that she often used very graceful imagery to temper elements of her work, which might have been some sort of challenge to the status quo. And I listened to an interesting talk recently by the artist Ellen Harvey, in which she described Kauffman as a stealth revolutionary. And I quite like that idea. So I just wanted to look at a couple of details here which might show that at play. So the only decoration on her simple dress is this beautiful cameo on her belt. And it's been identified as one that was in the Medici collection at the time. It displays, of course, Kauffman's respect for the Grand Duke, who was going to own the portrait, as well as her classical learning and erudition. But it's interesting to note that it was also a significant choice, because the cameo shows a contest between Athena and Poseidon over the city of Athens, which the goddess won. And furthermore, it's interesting to note that Kauffman includes a palette and brushes by her side, so you can just about see it down at the lower right. But what she's holding in her hand is a port crayon and a portfolio for drawings. And that's something that you see in many of her self-portraits. And the co-curator, Bettina Baumgartel, has written a lot about this, as it seems to be that Kauffman is deliberately referencing the Renaissance concept of disegno, or design, which was known as the father of all the arts. So she's co-opting this male role for herself. And moreover, there was a tradition of depicting disegno and colore, or design and coloring or painting, as contrasting male and female figures, as you can see in the example below by Guercino from the Getty in Los Angeles, where disegno is the man and the colourful figure painting is a woman. So quite interesting again that she's taking on this male role. So the next section goes more sort of chronologically rather than thematically, and covers Kauffman's early years as a professional artist in Italy, and then her move to London in 1766. So in Italy, she mixed with fellow artists, including Pompeo Battoni, who was the most popular portraitist for grand tourists at the time, Gavin Hamilton, neoclassical painter, and also Benjamin West, who she then meets again in London, as well as scholars like Winkelmann and many grand tourists and British expatriates living in Italy. These two aren't in the exhibition because we've actually started from the years when she begins as a professional artist rather than when she was training, but they're relevant to the next work, so I just wanted to show you them. So as a woman, Kauffman could not formally enroll at any art academy at the time, and she was excluded entirely from life drawing, a practice which was seen as fundamentally important at the time for a career in history painting, which was seen as the most important genre of art. So she wasn't daunted by that. Luckily, she had her father to train with instead, and between them, they sort of mimicked an academic curriculum as far as possible. So from 1761 onwards, they travel around Italy with extended stays in Florence, Rome, Naples, and Venice, where Angelica draws Greek and Roman sculpture and makes copies from the works of the old masters. As you can see here, two examples from Correggio and Domenichino, and they really do show her early talent as a painter. She was already making a name for herself at this point, but interestingly, descriptions of her at the time suggest that she was seen as a bit of a novelty, and that was part of her appeal. One contemporary writing from Rome in 1763 described her as follows. He said, "We have a little German paintress lately come here from Florence, where she'd acquired great fame, and whose pencil, they say, would merit no less patronage than her person, her voice, her manner, and her sense are sure to please." He mentions copies that she's made that were deemed excellent, including one of a Rembrandt, and that she's known for her portraits, adding, "She sings and understands music well. German and Italian are alike to her. She talks French, can hold some conversations in Spanish, and has lately made progress in English." So quite an impressive figure from a young age. But this is where we start the exhibition with Kauffman's Penelope at her loom. And this is a large and imposing canvas showing the direct influence of her study, both of classical art and literature and of Renaissance painting. And she sort of melds the two together very successfully. If her novelty and sociability or charm helped her to get noticed in the first place, her talent and erudition ensured that her fame became lasting. And she was very keen to demonstrate that she was not only a portraitist and copyist, but also a history painter because of the prestige associated with that genre at the time. And she was also particularly drawn to the neoclassical style and subject matter, and particularly as that held great intellectual sort of kudos at the time. So here she chose to depict Penelope, the wife of Ulysses from Homer's Odyssey. So a familiar story. He takes 10 years to get back from the Trojan War, and meanwhile, poor Penelope is stuck at home, fending off a group of suitors who gather on the island Ithaca, wanting her to remarry. And Penelope cleverly strikes a deal that she'll choose a suitor once she's finished weaving a funeral shroud for her father-in-law, Laertes. Although Penelope weaves all day, she then spends the nights unpicking everything she's done, and so putting off the evil day when she'll have to choose another husband. And she was, of course, well known from Homer's narrative and from the study of Greek vases, where she often appears, but she was not depicted in painting that much at this time. So it was quite original of Kauffman to have honed in on her subject matter. And once Kauffman did that, many others followed suit. And she's a particularly significant figure for Kauffman to have chosen because she's, in a sense, an artist herself, and one who uses her creativity and intelligence to exert control over her situation. And the motifs that Kauffman includes make reference to the eventual denouement of the story, which will happen soon. So on the left, you can see Penelope's got this kind of melancholic stance where she's leaning on the loom. But there's also Ulysses' bow on the floor, which he will eventually use to kill all these awful suitors, and his faithful dog Argos, who's transformed into this cute little sad lapdog sitting on the floor there. But Argos has an important role to play because it is Argos who first recognizes Ulysses when he returns to Ithaca in disguise. But poor Argos is so excited that he drops dead straight afterwards. So it's a little melancholy touch there. But at the same time, Kauffman also received numerous commissions for portraits. And it's interesting at this point that most of them were from men, and most of her friends at this point were from men, although she was presumably chaperoned by her father most of the time. But it makes it all the more striking that the mode of portraiture she adopted was one which emphasized a sense of familiarity with the subjects. And this in itself was potentially controversial, bearing in mind that there were contemporary concerns over the propriety of women painting men. James Boswell, for instance, recalled a conversation with Samuel Johnson in which the latter stated he thought portrait painting an improper employment for a woman. Public practice of any art, he observed, and staring in men's faces is very indelicate in a female. But luckily, she hadn't met him at that point, so she didn't know. But anyway, she was commissioned to paint Johann Joachim Winckelmann. And this was a particular coup for the young artist because he's now known as the father of art history, but he was already famous for several important texts he published on ancient Greek art. and he wanted the portrait engraved to feature in a forthcoming publication. So very high profile commission. And he wrote himself in a letter, "My portrait has been done by an unusual person, a German paintress for a friend. She's extremely good at oil portraits. She was at an early age brought to Italy by her father, who was also an artist. She thus speaks German like one who was born in Saxony. She also speaks fluent French and English, so she paints all of the English who visit here. She can be thought beautiful and sings as well as our best virtuosi." But what's striking about her depiction of Kauffman is that despite his fame and standing as an intellectual of the day, she shows him very informally dressed in this sort of house coat, as though she's just happens to be sitting there in his study while he's writing his great works. And he's lost in a moment of thought before he writes down his next line. And the only clue to his illustrious career is the relief that you can hardly see. It's just jutting out from under his book. But when you look closely at it, it's a carved relief of the three graces on which he's leaning his books. And that's something he had written about in his publications. But also painting famous figures like Winckelmann increased Kauffman's own fame and standing. She met David Garrick also in Naples while he was traveling in Italy with his wife, and she painted this portrait in 1764. So as England's most famous actor, he'd been depicted, as I'm sure you know, by many artists, including Reynolds and Zoffany, and he was often shown in costume or assuming one of his roles. But again, Kauffman goes for a completely different approach with no props at all in this case. Just Garrick turning around in his chair, again with this sort of spontaneity, as though he's just leaning around and pulling pushing the chair to help him lean around to talk to the artist. But as we've already seen, there are often further layers here. And so I just included here one of these portraits by Frans Hals, just to indicate she'd obviously been looking at something like that. It appears to be a spontaneous gesture, but she had great art historical knowledge as well. And this is a motif she seems to have taken from Frans Hals. But at the same time, as Winckelmann's letter suggested, Kauffman was particularly popular among British visitors, and so she begins to think about the possibility of going to London herself. Cleverly, she sends this painting of Garrick ahead of her to London to be exhibited and to help make her name. So by the time she arrives, everyone's wanting to know who Angelica Kauffman, who's painted Garrick, is. I should say Frans Hals sadly isn't in the exhibition, only Garrick, but it's just a comparison. So she arrives in London in 1766, travelling for the first time without her father, but with Lady Wentworth Murray, wife of the British ambassador to Venice. So she had a ready-made entree to society and very quickly establishes herself in London's cultural and elite circles. And she developed a specific mode for the portraits she was commissioned to paint of women in London. This really sort of took off after her first year or two in London. And she was in great demand to be painted, particularly by aristocratic women. And these are slightly different to the paintings of Garrick and Winckelmann that we've seen. There's still a sort of intimacy and informality, but instead she often depicted these women wearing Turkish dress. And that was part of a wider fashion, which had been promoted by the travel writing of Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, and was often a feature at masques and parties as well. So sometimes in a more sort of frivolous sense that it was used. Kauffman doesn't do that so much, but Wortley Montagu had commended the comfort of loose-fitting Turkish clothes and stated, "I look upon Turkish women as the only free people in the empire." So Kauffman's portraits depict these women often in quite sort of classicizing interiors, creating what has been described as a sort of inner orient and a kind of private space for these cultural women away from the male gaze. The portraits also make reference to Kauffman's history paintings. So on the left, you can see Martha Cox, who sits at her embroidery, which very much resembles the depiction of Penelope's loom. And then on the right, you can see a painting which isn't in the exhibition, but I just included it because it shows the Duchess of Gordon holding onto a bow and arrow. So very much a reference to Penelope. And we'll come back in a second to Kauffman's involvement with the Royal Academy project, but I've added in this just to show the context in which her history paintings were generally seen by the public in London. From 1768 onwards, she makes a great point of showing history paintings every year at the Academy. including further Homeric subjects, like on the top left, Hector taking leave of Andromache, and on the lower right, the return of Telemachus. But she also, as we'll see, painted scenes from a very wide range of sources, including Renaissance literature, Shakespeare, and English history. But the annual exhibitions proved highly popular and helped Kauffman to make her name. She was keen to ensure the reproduction of her exhibits as prints. As you can see here, I included the picture of the exhibition at the top. You can't really see it, but on the far right there, that's the painting of Telemachus that was shown at the Royal Academy that year. But she had a lot of her paintings reproduced as prints. And this is, I'll go through this one very briefly, but it was just to note that, of course, plenty of history paintings of the time did include female figures, but I added these just to show that some of the most popular and lauded examples of the period could be very male-dominated indeed, both in their subject matter and in their presentation. So these are both by Benjamin West. The Death of General Wolfe was one of the most famous history paintings of the time. And on the right, another example that he painted for George III. Interesting to note that he'd already really cornered the market in royal patronage for history painting, so Kauffman had to look elsewhere for her commissions. But from the start of her career, her history paintings consistently foreground female characters. Both well-known characters and more obscure ones. And even when depicting scenes that nominally relate to the narrative around a male character, she usually included women prominently in the composition. In the individual scenes that that Kauffman painted, the women often display qualities which very much suit the prevailing moral values of the time, so self-sacrifice, loyalty, this sort of thing. But at the same time, it's striking to see the extent to which she highlighted a string of very active and complex heroines. So we'll see some of these as we go through. She exhibited this picture of Cleopatra at the Academy in 1770. And it's an evocative image in which she takes a new perspective on Cleopatra. Paintings of the Egyptian queen were familiar at the time, but she was most often shown usually partially draped and in the act of committing suicide after Mark Antony's death. Kauffman takes a sort of different approach. Cleopatra is fully dressed in this sort of pure white dress, and with her attendants adorns the tomb of her lover, Mark Antony, with garlands of flowers. It follows a passage in Plutarch's Lives in which Cleopatra, now a Roman captive, asks to pay her respects at the tomb, and there she laments that he is buried in Egypt while she is about to be taken to Rome and she'll die there, and she then resolves instead to kill herself at his grave. So on one level, Kauffman makes it about Cleopatra more than the character of Mark Antony, but she's also rendered Cleopatra a much more relatable figure of a grieving widow. And in another sense, to those familiar with the details of the story, the scene also is very poignant, as shortly after this moment, the full tragedy will unfold with Cleopatra and her attendants killing themselves at the tomb. And you know these two, so I probably don't need to say too much about them, but we're very happy to have them in the exhibition. And it was really, we wanted to show with these that despite her adherence to neoclassicism, Kauffman did not confine herself to classical scenes and instead produced a great variety of subjects drawn from her wide reading. And these scenes are both from the epic poem Jerusalem Delivered by the Renaissance poet Torquato Tasso, set during the First Crusade, with this really fantastical story of the Crusader knight Rinaldo and the sorceress Armida. So she intends to kill him, but instead falls in love with him, takes him off to her magical garden where he falls in love with her and forgets about the Crusades. Convenient until two of his friends, who you can see on the top left of the painting on the left, turn up and ruin things by showing him a mirror, and he sees that he's being dressed in effeminate clothes with garlands of flowers, and he sort of wakes up and decides to go back to the Crusades. In the second, the tables have turned. So in the first one, Armida is clearly dominant before the two knights turn up. And on the right-hand side, then she's begging Rinaldo not to leave her, and reacts with anger and despair when he refuses. So quite interesting to see these different sort of dynamics of the story played out in the different depictions of the narrative by Kauffman. And at the time, Tasso's poem was very well known. And also perhaps less familiar now, parts of the story were frequently depicted in 17th and 18th century art. And the story also inspired many musical and operatic compositions, including examples by Handel, Gluck, Salieri, and later Rossini. So interesting to see Kauffman picking up on those sort of contemporary resonances as well. And this is a really fantastic painting in which Kauffman turned to English history to find a dramatic episode and an interesting female protagonist, Queen Eleanor of Castile. So it's a medieval scene this time. Eleanor married Edward I when he was Prince of Wales and accompanied him on the Ninth Crusade. And while they were in the Middle East, he's supposed to have been stabbed by a poisoned dagger. And according to anecdotal sources, which are probably sadly not true, Eleanor saved his life by springing into action and without thought for herself, sucking the venom from his wound. So luckily they both lived, but presumably she was endangering herself by doing that. And according to historians, it was probably a doctor who saved him. But anyway, it's an interesting story and one that Kauffman, really honed in on. And she was one of the first artists to show scenes from English history at the Academy, that is, scenes which were from a historical source, not just from the plays of Shakespeare. And many other artists followed her lead, and she also painted several other scenes from British history. Lastly, in this section, these two small works are very finely painted in oil on copper, which is sadly not very evident from the images, but apologies. And it's easy to underestimate their importance, but these works and others like them are a subtle distillation of history painting, which were much more marketable and at the same time carry the same level of emotive significance, but through association with grand overarching themes rather than specific narrative incident. Shakespeare's Tomb is based on a poem that was recent at the time by John Gilbert Cooper, entitled The Tomb of Shakespeare of Vision. And the figure at the tomb is a personification of Fancy, with the wings on her head denoting thought and inspiration. And there's a matching painting that depicted the birth of the bard. So the two together evoke contemplation on life and death and fame and passage of time. And then on the right, Poor Maria was inspired by a character from Lawrence Sterne's Tristram Shandy and the sentimental journey through France and Italy, which had been published in the 1750s and 60s, so quite recent at the time. And she's a bereaved shepherdess who the character Yorick meets in the countryside near Malines in France. And this melancholy figure was intended to evoke a sense of pity in the reader or viewer and became hugely popular and often depicted. Kauffman was one of the first to depict her. This kind of sentimentality, sadly, seems not to resonate so well sometimes with contemporary taste and can be dismissed as rather insignificant or chocolate boxy. But I would argue that images like this were really part of the cult of sensibility at the time, and they really caught the public imagination, being reproduced all over the place as prints and on decorative items and in decorative interiors. Kauffman also painted multiple versions of Poor Maria, including one for Catherine the Great. But we're moving on now to the Royal Academy. So we have a section where we unpack the question of how Kauffman came to be one of the founding members of the Academy in the first place and her interactions with the institution during the years she was in London. So when the Academy was founded in 1768, she was one of only two women, along with the painter Mary Moser, who were included among an initial group of 32 men, and then there were two more added by the king to make up an original group of 36. And there were no elections, they were sort of self-assembled, which might have helped, I think, with including the women. The Academy was set up to raise the professional status of artists in Britain, to promote the production of works in the grand manner, emulating Renaissance and classical art. So Kauffman was in many respects a very ideal candidate. She was dedicated to history painting. She'd studied in Italy. She was already a member of 3 Italian academies at this point. But on the other hand, she was young, female, a new arrival in the country, and perhaps most significantly of all, she had in 1767, so just the year before, married an imposter calling himself the Count de Horn. The clue was in the name. But this deception was exposed within a few months of the marriage and it was declared invalid, but did have the potential to really become a great scandal for Kauffman that could have affected her career quite badly. But I think what protected her and tipped the balance in her favour of her inclusion at the Academy were the friendships and patronage that she forged as soon as she arrived in England. So within weeks of arriving in London, she'd already hot-footed it over to Joshua Reynolds' studio with an introduction, I think, from Lady Wentworth. And they got on so well that shortly afterwards, they agreed to paint each other's portraits. The Miss Angel nickname comes from his diary entries recording her sittings for her portraits, where she appears as Miss Angel or Miss Angelica. Kauffman depicted Reynolds in his studio as though tuning into inspiration from the bust of Michelangelo next to him and the stack of books on his table, which are written by friends of his, before starting work on the canvas that you can see on the right, a blank canvas. And in a very cheeky touch, it's already signed, not by Reynolds, but by Kauffman. You can't really see it here, but when you're in the gallery, it's quite clear. And yeah, very nice touch. They were obviously on very good terms to be able to sort of joke like that with each other, which is interesting because Reynolds was 20 years older than her. And as she called him, the first painter in England. But he seems always to have taken her very seriously and was very supportive of her throughout her time in London. And we'll come back to him briefly in a minute. The print is just a reproduction of the image that Reynolds produced of Kauffman. At the same time, she also made quick inroads with royal patronage, specifically with royal women, receiving commissions from the Queen Mother to paint her daughter, Princess Augusta, who you can see on the left. She's not in the exhibition, sadly. And afterwards from Queen Charlotte, and this print does feature. The Queen and Kauffman, both being native German speakers, were described as spending many hours of easy and familiar conference together. The painting of Queen Charlotte is sadly lost, but we were able to represent it with the high quality print instead. Kauffman's involvement with both Reynolds and the royal family, I think, helped to ensure that she was part of the original group of Royal Academicians. And we have this well-known image, which has been much discussed, especially in terms of the gender dynamics, because Johann Zoffany decided to commemorate the early academicians in 1771 by depicting them apparently setting up a life drawing class, which meant that the two women, of course, could not be present. And he comes up with this quite clever solution of putting them on the wall as paintings instead. But of course, to modernize, all that does is to point out the fact that they are other and not quite on the same level as their male peers. It's been memorably described by Angela Rosenthal as an icon of exclusion, and it certainly sets the women apart and highlights the sort of ambivalence of their status at the Academy. They were very much part of the public face of the Academy and its exhibitions, but in terms of the private inner workings of the institution, they were more or less totally excluded, and that's what we see here. We've also included this painting in the exhibition. If Zoffany's painting epitomizes the sort of boys' club that Kauffman and Moser were dealing with, we wanted to include this image of a kind of women's equivalent that was beginning to emerge at the time. And this is a group portrait showing a group of blue stockings, as they were known, learned or cultured women. And it's unique at this date in British art for defining a group of women by their professional status. And their achievements are also presented as a sort of symbol of national progress in the arts and culture, as the painting derives from a slightly earlier print by the same artist, Richard Samuel, entitled The 9 Living Muses of Great Britain. So both works celebrate Kauffman's high standing as an artist. She's the only representative of the visual arts included. The others are writers, historians, and musicians. And they also show that by this time, this was exhibited in the late 1770s, she'd been clearly adopted as a British artist. But casting the women in the role of muses was intended to imbue the depiction with extra gravitas, yet the traditional role of muse can be viewed as quite problematic because the women are usually ethereal sort of conduits of inspiration to great men. But in this case, they're very much real figures, and they embody both the role of muse and creator, which is a combination that Kauffman also explored in her work. The flip side, though, of all her fame at the Academy and elsewhere was a seam of gossip and innuendo which seemed to follow her around all the time. And this seems to have been particularly problematic in the first half of the 1770s, with satirical representations like this one that really sort of belittles and trivializes her as an artist and characterizes her patrons, especially the men, as fashion victims, which is quite ironic because actually she often depicted them in, as I said before, in a sort of more broadly fashionable sense, rather than these sort of passing details of hairdos and things like that. These two are caricatures by the artist Nathaniel Dance, who she met in Rome, and as far as he was concerned, they were engaged to be married. She seems not to have been so convinced and distanced herself from him as soon as she got to London. And so that was much to his displeasure. And he started painting these rather jealous, drawing these little jealous caricatures about her and Reynolds, so you can see on the left, and drawing pictures of her with a sort of bigger nose than he drew before. But these rumours took on a more tangible public form at the Academy in 1775, when fellow academician Nathaniel Hone submitted a painting called The Conjurer. And the most obvious target of that was Reynolds, as he was known for his recycling of motifs from the old masters in his work. And the figure of the Conjurer is based on one of Reynolds' well-known models. But in addition, this was considered to be taking aim at Kauffman. It's not entirely obvious at first, but the child at his knee is quite similar to her painting of Hope, which had just been released as a print. And much more scurrilously in the background, you can see this weird group of naked artists cavorting in front of St. Paul's Cathedral, one of them a woman wearing just black stockings. And Kauffman and others took this as referring to her because she, Reynolds, and a few other academicians had been part of a short-lived commission to paint the interiors of St. Paul's Cathedral, which didn't happen because the bishop objected to it, but that's what it is referring to. So she immediately objected to this work being exhibited, and the RA appears to have prevaricated somewhat, leading her to write a letter, which we've shown in the exhibition. I haven't shown it here, but she demanded that this be removed or she would leave the Academy. And to cut a long story short, she won and Hone had to remove his painting. And I think she was treated with a bit more respect at the Academy after that. Certainly, by 1780, she was one of a small group of artists who were commissioned to decorate the interiors of new Somerset House, the new purpose-built rooms of the Royal Academy. And her commission was a particular honour because it was for the RA's council room where all the decisions were made. And she showed the four fundamental stages of the creative process: invention, design, composition, and colouring. And so we have two of them in the exhibition. We have design and composition, but the other two are going to Tate, where you'll be able to see them in an exhibition about women artists in Britain from the Renaissance onwards. Kauffman's depictions refer to the ideas in Reynolds' discourses and earlier art theory, but at the same time, she put her own stamp on this group, depicting all four personifications as women. And these have been described as self-portraits, but if you look at them closely, especially with a self-portrait nearby, the faces are much more generic. And so it's a sort of self-referential image in the fact that they're all women, but they're not actually self-portraits. I just included these to show that we have some preparatory drawings for them in the exhibition, suggesting that there was probably some sort of process of discussion about how these would look with Reynolds and probably Sir William Chambers, the architect of the building. And this painting, produced over a decade later, shows both Kauffman and Moser in the room this time, but they are right at the back. So they've made a little progress. But it's of interest here because it shows the two paintings. So we know that design and composition were shown together. There's some debate about which way round they go. And I just wanted to show a close-up of design. It's an interesting image because it shows a woman artist drawing the Belvedere torso. So although the women couldn't draw the nude male figure, they could draw plaster casts after them. And she seems to be making a bit of a point here. It also refers to the Academy setting. There was a cast of the Belvedere torso at the Academy in the same room as her painting. And it ended up becoming quite emblematic of the institution. So I've shown the medal there. It's the back of the silver medal from the Royal Academy schools that already existed. But afterwards, Benjamin West and others include the same cast in their self-portraits. And above is another drawing, probably by Nathaniel Dance, much earlier drawing of Kauffman when she was in Rome. But was she aware of this? I wonder if she was. We've included it in the exhibition because it's so close to the way she depicts design. Lastly, in this section, before we move on, I realise I'm going on a little, we include a self-portrait well, sorry, we look again at the artistic dialogue between Reynolds and Kauffman. So that's her portrait of Reynolds on the left, but comparing it to his later self-portrait for the Royal Academy, where he includes several of the same motifs that she used. And there's a lovely dialogue between the two artists. These little kind of motifs crop up quite a lot, and it goes both ways. So right at the end of the exhibition, we don't have Reynolds' portrait, but we have Kauffman's self-portrait, where, again, in answer to his use of her painting, she seems to paint herself in a very similar manner, or at least in a similar position, but she swaps Michelangelo for the goddess Minerva. Nice. And that's just another example of how the two artists were sort of in conversation through their works. So with that portrait of Garrick, Reynolds took that and painted something quite different with Mrs. Abingdon as Prue. So this takes us to the last section, and we look at Kauffman's work from 1782 onwards. In 1781, the imposter Count de Horn died, leaving Kauffman free to remarry the Italian painter Antonio Zucchi, who she'd known for many years. And with her aging father, they decided to move to Italy. And there were various reasons why they might have done that, but one of them is possibly the lack of full support for history painting in Britain. And she feels that Rome might be a better setting for her in that sense. She expanded her clientele and friendship group in Rome, but it's notable that she also kept up her contacts with her British friends and patrons as well. So this work, which again you'll know very well, was painted for George Bowles, who was one of her most loyal patrons and eventually owned over 50 of her works. It was painted as a gift, which is interesting because I think it speaks of their friendship, but perhaps also her concern that some of her supporters might feel she was abandoning them and suggests a wish to reassure them. Developing some of the themes we've seen emerging in other works, she paints herself here in the character of Design again, or Disegno, sitting with the muse of poetry. The latter is depicted wearing a laurel wreath and holding a lyre, and there's some similarity between this figure and Raphael's personification of poetry in the Vatican. Reynolds had spoken in his discourses of painting as a sister of poetry, but Kauffman changes that round slightly and makes it drawing. And as Bettina Baumgarten and other scholars have pointed out, it's notable that Kauffman sets up a sisterly and equal relationship between art and poetry. Poetry is really sort of whispering in her ear, and she's about to start drawing. She remained very popular as a portraitist, particularly with grand tourists, and these were two pendant portraits. Henrietta was painted first, and her fiancé Charles liked it so much that he not only paid for the portrait, but also commissioned his own to go with it, and specifically asked to be portrayed in this Van Dyck dress. So Kauffman has moved on from that very informal approach she had early on, but it's still, I think, a way of developing her portraiture without making it too staid and stagey. It gives it a sort of sense of levity. And although these don't have quite the same sort of sense of intimacy as some of the earlier portraiture, they do retain a sense of uncluttered focus on the sitter rather than the background detail. So they're quite sort of close focus, especially when you see them in the gallery. She continued with her history paintings as well. She did continue with some of those single figure paintings, but tended in Rome towards more complex compositions like this example. And here she chose a story from the play of the same name, Alcestis or Alcestis by Euripides. But it was also a narrative that, again, had been reworked in the 18th century in operas by Handel, Gluck, and others. So again, those kind of contemporary resonances come through. And significantly, Kauffman here chose a story in which the heroic deathbed scene is given not to the male hero, but to a woman. Apollo grants King Admetus a longer life than his allotted years, but the fates require someone else to die in his place. None of his subjects step up for that offer, and instead Alcestis decides to sacrifice her life for his. It was not a particularly common scene at the time, though there are earlier examples, but interestingly, in those depictions, Alcestis appears usually to be already dead, whereas Kauffman heightens both the drama and the sense of Alcestis's agency in this choice by showing her still alive. And spoiler alert, if you don't know already, there is a happy ending because Hercules turns up and wrestles death for the body of Alcestis. This is another return to Homer's Odyssey. Ulysses on the island of Circe, where she's usually represented as a sorceress and often as more threatening or more alluring. But again, in Kauffman, she's in this sort of virginal white dress and doesn't seem particularly threatening. Ulysses and Circe seem to be sort of on a level, talking to each other and working out if they can trust each other. She didn't paint that many religious scenes in England, but after returning to Rome, she developed a greater interest in such subjects, favouring biblical scenes. And I just included this one of Christ and the Samaritan woman, mainly because it was one of the paintings left in her studio when she died, and it was carried in procession at her grand funeral in Rome in 1807. But lastly, we come to a group of striking portraits, which Bettina Baumgartel has called attitudes portraits. They're often of friends and fellow female creatives, in which Kauffman employs the imagery of the muses to great effect. So these were two friends of Kauffman's from Rome, Domenica Morgan and Maddalena Volpato, as the muses of tragedy and comedy. Then two poets, Teresa Bandettini and Fortunata Fantastici Silga, which is a fantastic name. But these were also quite fantastic figures. They were impromptu poets. So they performed at Kauffman's Rome salon, where they would take a theme given by the audience and just sort of extemporize on that, like a sort of improv session where they would come up with songs and poetry based on the theme they'd just been given. And Kauffman depicts them again as muses, but also as creators, so particularly sort of powerful sense of their presence. And her first biographer described the two women performing at her salon and said, "I remember hearing each of these valorous women improvising in Kauffman's home, and perhaps neither of them ever sang better than in these moments. In fact, their inspiration must have ignited and burned in a place that could almost be called the temple of female glory." So as well as painting sisterly images of herself with poetry, she also did foster these friendships with other creative women. This one is the famous Emma Hamilton, often depicted by artists, but again, there's a sense of her actually about to perform one of her famous attitudes here. So again, as the creator, as a performance artist, and she was painted at the height of her respectability at this point. She'd just married Sir William Hamilton, the ambassador to Naples, so before her famous affair with Lord Nelson. And she is portrayed as Talia, muse of comedy and bucolic poetry, as though just appearing about to perform her attitudes, in which she takes on different poses of classical and Renaissance figures, but which were hugely popular and famous at the time. And lastly, we come to one of Kauffman's late self-portraits, which is a really audacious, monumental painting, depicting a moment from her own life on the same scale and with the same sense of importance as a scene from history, mythology, or the Bible. And it really is, it's sort of slightly more than life-size. So when you see it in the gallery, it really is an imposing painting. So she's looking back at a moment from her early life and dramatizing the choice she made between music or art as a career. She cast herself in a role that would have been at the time understood as referring to Hercules at the crossroads, where he has to make a choice between a life of virtue or one of vice. And I don't think she's saying that music was vice, but instead I think it's the easier path that would have been easier for her. And instead, the figure of painting gestures out to the landscape towards the Temple of Fame, perched on a craggy, forbidding hilltop, suggesting that this path will be hard, but worth it. Is she choosing, or has she in fact already made up her mind? I think she's, in my opinion, already made up her mind, and she's consoling music and about to leave with painting. This was just to show on the left an example of Hercules at the crossroads, which would have been well known, and interestingly, an image where Reynolds used that same imagery in quite a comic painting showing David Garrick having to choose between the alluring figure of the muse of comedy and the very stern muse of tragedy. Unlike Reynolds, though, Kauffman doesn't seem to be making any jokes, much more serious. She's staking her claim to be considered as a great artist, with this painting as proof of both her merits and of the fact that she's already achieved fame through her art. This self-portrait is in many ways a strident painting, but it has to be noted that while co-opting the male role of Hercules, she also presents herself and the two figures as the three graces. So some commentators have seen that as negative, but I would say it's a virtuoso of an example of her ability to produce subtle and multivalent imagery. And I'll leave the last word to her fellow academician, James Barry, who certainly understood its importance. He's reported to have said, "Some may say that this work is great because it was executed by a female, but I say that whoever produced such a picture, in whatever age, whatever country, it is great, it is noble, it is sublime." And I can't top that, so I will leave it there.